Whether you're an engineering enthusiast or an eager spectator, the evocative image of a steam train rumbling through the British landscape is a stirring and nostalgic sight. As clouds of steam billow into the air, with engines driven over winding tracks, there are few amongst us who will fail to be mesmerised by this wonderful sight, now so rarely seen. Once a groundbreaking mode of transport, which propelled the industrial world into the 20th century, the steam locomotive is now reserved for the pleasure of tourists and owes its survival to those who are most passionate about its preservation. Not only is the steam train a joy to experience, but it's also a wonderful way to explore the British countryside, to visit ancient monuments and medieval churches, and to discover a little more about the history of the country. Alternatively, it can simply be a delightful way to take a well-deserved break from the stresses and strains of modern life, as you sit comfortably, gaze out of the window, and watch the world go by. In this programme, we'll be exploring the Dean Forest Railway, hidden deep within one of England's oldest surviving areas of woodland. Sprawling from the River Wye to the north and the River Severn to the south, the ancient and royal Forest of Dean boasts some truly glorious sights and has proved to be a source of great inspiration for writers and artists alike. The Lord of the Rings is a classic example, as J.R.R. Tolkien immortalised these picturesque surroundings in his writing, and from castles and lakes to bluebells and arboretums, wherever you turn, you'll be sure to find scenes to enthrall and delight. And what better way of exploring the forest could there be than by steam? During the programme, you'll have the opportunity to find out a little about the mechanics of the steam engine, the evolution of the signalling system, as well as discovering more about places you can visit on this particular journey. Also, you'll have the chance to see engines from a number of other preserved steam railways into the bargain. But before we begin our forest journey, it's worth taking a step back in time to discover the origins of steam travel in Great Britain and find out a little about the extraordinary characters who brought about such revolutionary changes in the history of transport. The Scottish inventor and mechanical engineer James Watt was the first to really harness the power of steam as far back as the 18th century. But it wasn't until the 19th century that his work was used to improve transport. Although railways already existed, it was horses that were used to pull wagons along them, especially when it came to carrying heavy loads such as coal from the mines. As the Industrial Revolution gathered pace, canal mania had swept Britain by the late 18th century, with the development of the inland waterways. But whether transported by water or along a horse-drawn railway, progress was very slow. As a result, engineers began experimenting with steam to drive a locomotive, and very rapidly the canals were forgotten with the dawn of the railway age. It was a Cornishman, one Richard Trevithick, who first developed a steam-powered road vehicle. The London road carriage made its first journey in 1803, but the carriage was expensive to run and uncomfortable for passengers, so the novelty of this extraordinary contraption soon wore off. Nevertheless, just 1 year later, Trevithick came to prominence again, when he mounted a steam engine on wheels to haul iron along the Merthyr Tydfil tramroad. It was a primitive design, but in 1804 it carried 10 tons of iron and 70 men, nearly 10 miles, which was a groundbreaking event for the industrial world. Even so, at 5 miles per hour, there were still many improvements to be made, and while Trevithick went on to create storage heaters, pumps and steam tugs, it wasn't until the 1820s that the notion of the steam train really took off, as the man credited with being the father of the railways, George Stephenson, stepped into the limelight. One of the first major problems that Stephenson had to overcome was the weight of the steam engine and the problems this caused the rails. Trevithick's steam locomotive proved too cumbersome for the wooden rails of the tramway to be used regularly, and was even heavy enough to break rails made of cast iron. Stephenson made improvements to the design of rails, and also looked at how to distribute weight more effectively along the tracks through better spacing of the locomotive wheels. If you look at steam trains today, you'll notice that coupling rods are used to connect the wheels. Stephenson's locomotion was the first engine to do this, with the inefficient method of linking the wheels with chains replaced by rods, ensuring that the wheels stayed at an equal distance from each other. When Stephenson opened the Stockton-Darlington Railway in 1825, he used wrought iron rails, which could be produced in much longer lengths than those made of cast iron, and were much less liable to crack under the weight of heavy locomotives. As Stephenson's railway swiftly transported coal from the collieries in Darlington to the port at Stockton, rich northern investors soon saw the vast potential of this new form of transport, and embarked upon a project to link the city of Manchester, famous for its cotton factories, with the thriving port of Liverpool. And to determine who would win the contract for building the locomotives, a competition, the Rainhill Trials, was held in 1829. By now, George Stephenson's son Robert had started to work with his father, and together they designed a locomotive with enough power to pull huge amounts of freight across the countryside. But the Stephensons realised that the obstacle they needed to overcome was the limited amount of steam they could produce. Robert Stephenson came up with the ingenious idea of replacing the single flue that ran through the boiler with a great number of tubes. When the flame and heated air passed through the tubes, they covered a much larger surface area, heating up the surrounding water and producing steam much more rapidly. The improvement to the locomotive design had impressive results during the Rainhill Trials, when Stephenson's rocket covered 35 miles in 3 hours and 12 minutes, hauling 13 tons of loaded wagons. It was enough to win the day, and they were awarded the contract to build locomotives for the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. And the innovative Stephensons went from strength to strength. They engineered a floating line made of wood and stone over the bottomless peat bog of Chat Moss on the outskirts of Manchester. Realising that even the slightest incline or decline in gradient could greatly decrease the speed, they dug tunnels through hills and started to build great railway viaducts which spanned across the valleys of the north. The British landscape was changing dramatically, and the canal companies went into a rapid decline. Interestingly, many of the newly formed railway companies bought up the canals, and you'll often see the railway tracks running alongside the waterways, which had been engineered along the flattest and most economic routes linking mines and factories with Britain's major cities and ports. Even today, the great engineering feats of the Stephensons can still be seen in use. Summit Tunnel is one of the oldest railway tunnels in the world, having been built between 1838 and 1841, running under the Pennine Hills, forming a vital gateway between Manchester and Leeds. The tunnel was mined by hand through shale, coal and sandstone, then lined with 6/4 of bricks to form the horseshoe shape that gives it the characteristic entrance you can see today. Vertical shafts were drilled through the hillside to provide survey points from above, and after the tunnel's completion were kept as blast relief shafts to vent steam from the locomotives that passed through. Curiously, as heat built up in the ground surrounding the tunnel, the warm soil triggered new growth in the plants above, and flowers started to bloom, causing a phenomenon that was known as a false spring. Though today, with steam trains no longer passing through, the flowers have gone, but the tunnel has been continuously used by passengers and for freight since it opened. The only exception was when it closed for the first 8 months of 1985, after part of a goods train burst into flames while in transit. While tunnels and great viaducts transformed the northern landscape, to the south there was a similar flurry of excitement, as a contemporary of Robert Stephenson, the innovative and daring Isambard Kingdom Brunel made his presence felt. At the extraordinarily young age of 27, Brunel had been appointed chief engineer to the Great Western Railway, which linked the capital city of London to the southwest and the major port of Bristol. It was Brunel's vision that passengers could purchase one ticket at Paddington Station and travel from London to New York, changing from the Great Western Railway to the Great Eastern Steamship at the terminus in Neyland, South Wales. He also had other exciting plans for the railway, and using extensive calculations, was of the opinion that there were considerable advantages to using a wider track gauge. While Brunel began building broad gauge railways with trains to match, not everybody agreed with innovative engineers' ideas. Further north, the gauge that George Stephenson had chosen for his line was based on the width of farm carts and measured 4 feet 8.5 inches and was much narrower than Brunel's tracks. Consequently, the northern half of the country ran on narrow gauge tracks, while in the south, Brunel's broad gauge was used, which was fine until the railways met and chaos ensued. The government eventually had to intervene, and despite Brunel having the upper hand scientifically, more miles of narrow gauge track had already been laid. The government, influenced by the powerful railway companies of the north, sided against him, and Stephenson's narrow gauge came to be adopted as the standard gauge for railways, not only in Britain, but also throughout the world. So, ironically, the trains of our modern high-tech rail system today run on tracks based on the average width of farm carts from the early 19th century. Difficult as it must have been for Brunel to see his wide-gauge trains being reduced to scrap metal, the young engineer was not to be deterred, and his innovative designs went from strength to strength. From Cornwall to Maidenhead, he built magnificent bridges, and without doubt, one of Brunel's best-loved constructions is the Clifton Suspension Bridge, which runs across the Avon Gorge to Bristol. With its Egyptian-style towers and elegant shape, it was a great tribute to Brunel's talent. The engineer even had the idea of adding sphinxes to the tower, which were fashionable at the time. Way below lay Bristol Docks, which today provides a safe haven for another of Brunel's remarkable achievements. This is the SS Great Britain, the first iron-built steamship to be screw-propelled across the Atlantic, designed by Brunel to improve links with the rest of the world for his Great Western Railway. Sadly, Brunel never lived to see the completion of the Clifton Suspension Bridge, but today his ships, tunnels and bridges stand testament to his genius. From Brunel's achievements in the southwest, this is the perfect opportunity to return to the Dean Forest Railway, which can be found less than 30 miles to the north of Bristol across the Severn Estuary. Here in the Forest of Dean, this is a railway that actually predates Stephenson and Brunel and has been in operation first under horsepower and then steam since 1809. Today the surroundings are calm and picturesque, making it difficult to imagine what this place would have been like as it buzzed with the activity of the Industrial Revolution. In the 19th and early 20th century, the Forest of Dean was a complex industrial region with deep coal and iron mines, foundries and quarries, which required a network of railways to transport such valuable commodities across the woodland terrain. Back in the 19th century, the steam trains that ran along these tracks were used purely for the purpose of transporting iron ore and coal to the harbours further south. It's thought that as early as the 5th century BC, rich seams of iron ore, coal and limestone were discovered here, and if you explore the local caves or take a look into the streams and rivers, you'll find that traces of these precious minerals can still be seen to this day. Traditionally, men born within the forest's boundaries are allowed to dig for iron ore and coal in the open cast mines scattered across the area. There are few free miners left working the lodes today, but those that remain certainly guard their mineral rights fiercely. Despite the obvious natural resources, by the 20th century there was little future for the miners of the Forest of Dean. The last commercial iron mine in the district closed in 1946, and by the 1960s the steam trains, which were such a vital link between the industries of the district, were becoming a thing of the past, and many branch lines were closed. Today, the main industry in the Forest of Dean is tourism, but as people flock to the countryside, escaping the hustle and bustle of city life, the steam trains have very definitely made a very welcome comeback. The headquarters for the Dean Forest Line is at Norchard, which lies between the tranquil village of Parkend to the north and the small town of Lydney to the south. Norchard boasts a range of locomotives, but the gleaming black engine you can see rolling into the station today is Forest Pannier 9681, which was built at the famous Swindon Works in 1949. In terms of preserved steam engines, this is actually quite a youngster, although it still took a great deal of work to restore this fine locomotive to its former glory. Like so many wonderful old engines, 9681 became redundant with the closure of branch lines in the 60s, and in 1965 it seemed as if this engine had literally reached the end of the line when it made its final journey to a scrapyard in South Wales. For 10 years, battered by the elements, the abandoned locomotive fell into rack and ruin, until 9681 was finally rescued by the Forest Pannier Tank Fund in 1975. They'd raised the £3,600 needed to make the purchase, and quickly started the task of restoration. All around Britain today, you'll find workshops at preserved railways dedicated to the restoration of steam trains, and it's thanks to the painstaking labour of enthusiasts and volunteers that these glorious old engines can still be seen travelling through the countryside today. It took 9 years of devoted work before this particular pannier engine could be returned to service in 1984. It probably won't come as too much of a surprise that 9681 acquired the nickname Black Beauty when the restoration was complete, which was a wonderful tribute to all those who'd worked so hard to save this locomotive, which has since given such pleasure to so many people. As we watch Forest Pannier 9681 being prepared for a hard day's work, this is the perfect opportunity to explain a little more about how a steam engine actually runs. And from the outset, it certainly takes a lot longer for this type of locomotive to get started than our more modern diesel or electric trains. You can see for yourself that booting a steam engine, as this is known, is quite a task. Peer inside the cab of the engine, and you'll find the firebox, which has to have a constant feed of fuel to keep the steam flowing. During the journey, a steady supply of coal will need to be shoveled in. But to start the fire while the engine's cold, wood will also need to be added, and a rag soaked in kerosene will help to get things started. Once the fire's going, those tubes first introduced by the Stephensons will channel exhaust gases through the boiler and begin to heat up the gallons of water it contains. A boiler can contain up to several hundred tubes. Depending on the size of the train, heating the gallons of water contained within the boiler can take a great deal of time. In the case of Forest Pannier 9681, however, the results of the firemen's efforts can quickly be seen as a mixture of steam and smoke begins to pour from the chimney. As water turns to steam, it expands to a staggering 1,600 times the volume of an equal mass of water, so you can imagine the extraordinary amount of energy this provides when harnessed. To put things into perspective, 2,000 gallons of water vaporizes to create 3 million gallons of steam. This can become dangerous, and boiler explosions have meant the end of the line for a number of trains, as this photograph taken in 1850 illustrates. The Forest Pannier has a water capacity for 1,200 gallons, which will result in plenty of steam being generated throughout the day. The fireman will adjust the supply of fuel to get the water to simmer or come to a full rolling boil. As you can see here, the main fuel for the steam engine is coal, and this will generally be carried behind the engine in what is called the tender. The coal size is also important, and larger pieces need to be broken down to about the size of a man's fist to allow the spread of an even flame over the whole grate. Larger pieces would cause black spots in the fire, a sure sign of lower temperatures and less effective combustion. With a plentiful supply of coal in the tender, it's also important to stock up on that other vital commodity for the steam engine to function, namely water. And with so much needed to generate enough steam for a 4-mile journey, a stop at the water tower is definitely in order. These towers dedicated to the steam train can be found at stopping places all along the railway, so there's never a shortage of water. It isn't only the firemen hard at work at first light on steam days, as there's plenty to be done outside the engine as well. The train is always given a good clean ready for the day ahead, making sure that Forest Pannier 9681 is gleaming for all the visitors who will be arriving later, and you can see straight away that there are many differences between this steam engine and the earliest locomotives. The large round dome on top of the engine is where the steam is collected above the boiler before being released to the cylinders below. While the front of the engine is given a polish, we get a glimpse of the door to the smoke box. This part of the engine collects the hot gas that has passed from the firebox through the boiler tubes. It usually has a blower to help draw the fire and directs the steam up to the chimney. As well as cleaning the engine, it's important to make sure that everything from the wheels to the coupling rods are running smoothly. There are a few hundred lubrication points on a steam locomotive, and the ritual of oiling around the engine plays a vital part in the preparation of the train before it sets off on its travels. You'll notice that coupling rods link the wheels together, which ensures that power is distributed equally between them, which was, of course, one of George Stephenson's innovations. The wheels run in slots within the steel frame around which the locomotive is built, and mounted on top of these metal beams you'll find the cab, firebox, boiler and smokebox. This is also a good time to point out that British engines are always referred to as female. At first, this can be a little disconcerting, especially if you're looking at engines with masculine names such as King George or Black Prince. But even they will always be lovingly called she, despite their very royal connections. As the water in the boiler heats up, more steam is created, and you'll notice that not all the smoke and vapour is coming out of the chimney. There's also a safety valve mounted above the boiler, which is designed to allow steam to escape if the boiler pressure exceeds its limit. But as well as steam coming from above the engine, you'll also notice that it's being released from below. When a steam locomotive has been standing for a while, steam may condense in the cylinders as they cool. The resulting water can damage the cylinders and pistons when the locomotive then tries to move away. So cylinder drain cocks, controlled from the cab, are opened while the locomotive is standing. These won't be closed until after the locomotive starts to move away. The drain cocks are what produce the typical large clouds of steam from the front of a locomotive when it first begins to move. And with all this steam being generated, it's time to put it to good use. The total distance covered by the Dean Forest Railway through woodland, towns and villages is just over 4 miles, but today we'll be going on a slightly shorter journey, covering ground from the headquarters here at Norchard to Lydney Junction, a little further south of Lydney, near the River Severn. The trip to Park End will, on this occasion, have to be reserved for another visit. With passengers filling the carriages, it's time to set off through the ancient wooded landscape of the Forest of Dean, and the first stop beyond Norchard will be the town of Lydney. As you take in the views, you can certainly see why, way back before the Industrial Revolution, this district was used as a royal hunting ground, most notably in Norman times. Boar and deer roamed freely here, and you'll still find plenty of wildlife if you follow some of the woodland walks on offer. But while we're on the train, we can leave hiking expeditions for a later date and take this opportunity to look in a little more depth at how the steam engine works. As steam is produced, the expanding air in the cylinders inside the engine produces enough pressure to push the pistons. If you take a look at this much larger locomotive at the Gloucestershire-Warwickshire Railway called Black Prince, you can get a very clear view of the connecting rod which is linked to the driving wheels. This steel arm converts the horizontal motion of the piston into the rotation motion of the wheels. Of course, It's up to the driver to decide when the train begins moving and in which direction. And if you take a look at the interior of 3205, you can see exactly what happens inside the driver's cab. This area is called the footplate, and the big red lever you can see running across the cab from left to right is called the throttle or regulator. It opens a valve that controls how much steam is piped out of the boiler into the operating cylinders, which in turn set the pistons going, just as the accelerator would on a car. The circular handle you can see to the right of the regulator is called the screw reverser. This adjusts which side of the piston steam is supplied to when the regulator is opened, and also the amount of steam provided. As the train sets off, the screw is turned clockwise to its full extent, providing steam for 75% of the piston's travel to move the locomotive forwards. Once moving, the screw would be turned anti-clockwise to reduce the percentage as the train accelerates and less effort is required. Turning the screw anti-clockwise to its full extent provides steam to the opposite side of the pistons and reverses the direction of travel, and at mid-position no steam is supplied at all. Even though our modern trains of today are so much faster than the steam engine when it comes to speed, back in the 30s, this more aged form of transport did reach some impressive speeds. In 1938, a locomotive called the Mallard hit around 126 miles per hour on a run from King's Cross Station, setting the world speed record for steam locomotives. Rather faster than the speed we're travelling at today, it has to be said. Back in the 19th century, it wasn't quite as easy to reach such high speeds. Travelling long distances could also cause all manner of difficulties. Fire tubes and smoke boxes could be destroyed by heat, and this was especially problematic for some of Stephenson's trains. Robert Stephenson resolved the problem by extending the boiler and the fire tubes from the usual 9 feet to 13 or 14 feet. So, thanks to Robert Stephenson, our travellers are in no danger of an overheating smoke box today. And on our journey through the forest, the first place we come to, as promised, is the town of Lydney. Despite the fact that we're not stopping here today, Lydney is nonetheless historically rather significant. It was the home of Sir William Wintour, a favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, who was one of her great naval admirals at a time when the Spanish Armada were all set to invade England. When Tudor monarchs ruled supreme in the 16th century, the timber generated by the forest was considered to be some of the finest in the country. Many of the ships built to oppose the Spanish were constructed from the Forest of Dean's oak trees gathered from around Sir William's hometown. Centuries later, the arrival of the railways made a great impact on the small town, which stands on the north bank of the River Severn. A harbour was built to serve Lydney, which was the last port on the Severn where sea-going boats could load and unload their cargoes. Consequently, with coal, stone, tin plate and timber all being produced, and clay and salt needing to be imported, Lydney became a thriving community. At its busiest time, the dock handled in excess of 2,000 vessels and 300,000 tons of coal annually. Times have changed, and now Lydney is a relatively quiet town, much altered since its busy industrial days. As we travel further south, we are finally given the chance to pause and have a look around at some of the prettier sights to be found in the forest. This is St Mary's Halt, where visitors can explore the beautiful old church just beyond the station. The tower and chancel date back to the early 13th century, and it really is a lovely place to stop off and take in the tranquil surroundings. If you step inside, you'll find that although most of the stained glass windows are old, the window in the north aisle has a more contemporary feel. It was a gift to Lydney Park's Lord Bledisloe, otherwise known as Charles Bathurst, in the 1940s, and boasts an icy New Zealand landscape with a view of the Franz Josef Glacier. It commemorates Lord Bledisloe's tour of duty as governor of the country, and you'll also find that monuments and inscriptions in and around the church show the influence of the Bathurst family on the town of Lydney from the 18th century to the present day. From the platform, a beautiful cast iron lattice footbridge which dates back to 1892 will take you into the churchyard. This lovely construction was originally built to stop trespassers who were crossing the line in between the wagons loaded with forest coal waiting in the sidings. But today you'll find it a pleasant way to step over the railway to enjoy the splendid scenery. If you decide to stop here, there's also a delightful walk along the canal, which will take you back towards Lydney. But for those of you who prefer to stay on the train, we'll head towards the last stop on today's journey, Lydney Junction. Now, for anyone taking a train ride, looking out of the window is one of the greatest pleasures. But it's also worth mentioning the interior of the carriages at this point. Despite being a little bumpier than our modern trains, by the end of the 19th century, steam travel had become considerably more comfortable than in the days of Stephenson's rocket. You may be surprised to discover that in the early days, even the first-class passengers travelled in the equivalent of a horse box, making carriages rather dark and sinister. Whilst in transit, communication with the outside world would not be possible, and it was only after a gruesome murder was committed in a railway compartment that alarm cords were subsequently fitted. Second-class passengers might have been lucky enough to travel in a carriage with a roof, but the sides, without doubt, would have been open to the elements. Third-class passengers were not even able to sit, forced to stand crammed together in open trucks as they were jolted at speed along the tracks. As railway mania swept the nation, gradually improvements were made, and the polished woodwork and elegant upholstery of this Victorian carriage shows just how luxurious some compartments became. The carriages pulled by Forest Pannier 9681 may not be quite so luxurious, but as we approach Lydney Junction, most people are definitely more interested in what's going on outside, as there's a flurry of activity for the volunteer manning the signal box today. This wonderfully preserved signal box at Lydney Junction gives us the perfect opportunity to delve back into the history of rail travel once again. Before we go on to look at how the system works on the Dean Forest Railway, we'll step back in time and see how signalling actually began. Not long after the first passenger railways began to operate in the early 19th century, people began to realise that there was the need for some kind of system that would prevent two or more trains attempting to travel along the same stretch of railway at the same time. The consequences of this would of course be disastrous, as you can see in this photograph of a crash that took place in America in 1907. Early methods relied upon policemen at stations, crossings and junctions, using handheld flags to signal passing trains. With no communication possible between these men, they simply relied on a time interval system to prevent trains from running into one another, which was far from satisfactory. In 1841, Brunel provided disc and crossbar signals on the Great Western Railway, but in 1843 vast improvements were made with an idea courtesy of the Royal Navy. For several decades, the Navy had already been using a means of communication known as the flag semaphore signalling system, which the railways also put to very good use. In fact, despite radio communication now being a much more technologically advanced alternative, semaphore has remained an important feature of modern rail travel. Originally, this system was the brainchild of Claude Chappe, a French inventor, when France was in the grip of revolution at the end of the 18th century. The mechanical arm seen here was used to make different positions, which would in turn provide vital messages for those involved in the bitter conflict that cost so many their lives. Sadly, Chappe met a rather sorry end himself when rivals claimed his invention was plagiarized, and he became so depressed that he threw himself down a well. Despite Chappe's unfortunate death, rail travel has down through the ages been a great deal safer thanks to semaphore. If you look at the signals today, you'll notice they are a little different from the original semaphore, but they function just as well. If the arm is horizontal, it indicates danger, and when at an angle, it gives the all clear. Today, this can all be done remotely, but back in the 19th century, signalmen still had to operate the system manually, running back and forth between the signal and the points they controlled. And as track layouts became more complicated and the frequency of trains increased, so did the potential for accidents. It wasn't long before there was a necessity for a central control point, which brought about the development of the signal box. The first signal boxes were installed in the early 1860s on the approaches to London Bridge, and they eventually made their way to the Forest of Dean, as you can see here at Lydney Junction. Using mechanical lever frames, the signalman operates the signals and points via wires and rods. The red levers are for the signals, the black ones for the points, while the blue levers are for the facing point locks. You'll also find that at Norchard, the Dean Forest Railway headquarters, there's another signal box that's equally fascinating. Originally, the signalman only controlled the main signals and points for an area, while the points for many local sidings were still controlled from the individual levers next to the points. A good example of this can be found on the Gloucestershire-Warwickshire Railway, where the Gotherington ground frame is used. Generally, a ground frame is a small lever frame, which stands beside a railway at ground level and is typically used to control the points. These will give access to a siding that is used infrequently or has been designated for an emergency crossover. While these types of points still have to be operated by the train crew, over time, more and more controls were relocated to the signal boxes until all points on running lines were under the signalman's control. As the years passed and the speed of the trains increased, so did the likelihood of accidents, so further improvements were made to the signalling system. For single-track lines, the danger of collision was the greatest, so a fail-safe answer in the form of a token system was developed. This would require the signalman at the entrance of the station giving the driver a staff or a rod of wood or metal on which the name of the single line was stamped. Later, as the tokens became smaller, a hoop was added, so the fireman or driver could put their arms through easily to pick it up as they drove past. The train would have to slow down to make it easier to pick up the hoop. But as drivers tried to make up lost time, this wouldn't always be the reality, and bruised upper arms were commonplace. There was even the danger of missing the hoop altogether. As you can see, the method is still used on the Dean Forest Railway, and the driver of the train entering the branch line must be in possession of this staff or token to ensure that no collision with another train is possible. From the late 1880s, the token system was drastically improved, and various forms of electrically interlocked single-line token systems were introduced. The signal box at each end of the section was equipped with a token instrument, which was a machine which detected the removal or replacement of a staff or token. By now, the token had evolved into a small metal key, which would be pushed into the block, which took the relevant token at each end of a signal line section. These were electrically interlocked, so that the act of removing a token effectively locked both machines and prevented further removals from either block until the missing token was replaced at one end or the other. Of course, with new modern technology to hand, there are also a few luxuries that have been added to bring the signal box up to date, as you can see with this control for the level crossing gates. And with our tour of the signal box complete, it's time for us to depart from Lydney Junction, with the carriages of Forest Pannier 9681 now brimming with passengers ready to enjoy the return trip to Norchard. Most people, a visit to a preserved steam railway will be a wonderful day out, and hopefully you'll have enjoyed this brief glimpse into a day in the life of the Dean Forest Railway. But as our time draws to a close, we just have a few moments to take a look at other examples of steam preservation societies around the country. Firstly, we'll head in a northerly direction, where the first railways took off under the guiding hands of the Stephensons. This station at Haworth is on the Keighley and Worth Valley line in Yorkshire. It is not only a delight to see, but has an extraordinary history, as this is where the Bronte sisters, Authors of such classics as Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights would have had their first experience of rail travel. Prefer to head off in a more southerly direction, a trip to explore the Isle of Wight steam railway based at Haven Street will be a real treat. Once a thriving holiday destination, the Island Railway again has an amazing history, as well as owning a particularly beautiful collection of Victorian carriages. And of course, the good Queen herself was a regular holidaymaker in the district, and you can visit Osborne House, Victoria and Albert's summer retreat, which is equally as well preserved as the railway. You can also see the remnants of the royal family's own personal station at Whippingham. There are plenty of halts where you can leave the train and explore the stunning countryside. While we're on the subject of stunning countryside, a visit to the Gloucestershire-Warwickshire Railway is a must. You may also get the opportunity to encounter the magnificent Black Prince that we've already seen featured in this programme. Along the line, there is the most picturesque array of beautifully restored Cotswold stations, and if you're yearning for a bit of peace and quiet, there's no better place to stop off than at Hales Abbey Halt, where you can explore the mystical ruins of a Cistercian abbey founded in the 13th century. Back in the Forest of Dean, our Pannier engine 9681 has at last reached Norchard, and although our time with the Dean Forest Railway is now at an end, thanks to the hard work of the dedicated volunteers who've turned their dreams into a reality, there's a great deal more for you to see should you find yourself in this truly amazing part of Great Britain, with history brought to life whenever the steam starts rising.